From political movements in France and Germany to the Netherlands' Party for Freedom and Austria's Freedom Party, political parties challenging the status quo in Central and Northern Europe appear to reflect a populist, anti-immigrant stance. The voters of these so-called populist parties bear a striking similarity to many of Donald Trump's supporters, whose surprising election to the White House sent shockwaves around the world. But for all they have in common, populism can mean different things to different groups and geographic locations. To help us understand what's behind this latest trend, we've assembled a distinguished panel. Lee Feinstein is the former United States ambassador to Poland. He joins us from Indiana University, where he's currently the dean of the School of Global and International Studies. With us from Beijing is the anchor of CCTV's World Insight, Tian Wei. Daniel Lansberg-Rodriguez is a frequent media contributor and teaches Latin American business at Northwestern University. He joins us from Chicago. And with us here in the studio is CCTV's Nathan King. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Nathan, let me start with you. Help us understand what we're talking about here. What is populism, and is it different depending where you are?
Well, for me this year, it's been a Donald Trump rally, because I've been to quite a few of them. It sort of defines it. But no, if you, loosely, populism is the rejection of elites. It is feeling that the elites are controlling everything and banding together in a popular movement to somehow resist it. And this is what we've been seeing.
Now, here is a phenomenon that might be different from other trends that we've seen in the past. Populism comes from both left and right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can be a populist on the left or the right. I mean, you just have to look at history. Going back to the French Revolution, they had their leftists and their rightists. Danton was definitely a populist, but so was Napoleon. So it really doesn't matter which bit of the spectrum you're from politically. And in fact, it's a rejection of that sort of left and right, which often makes populists popular. Donald Trump was a Democrat 5 years ago. Is he pro-abortion? Is he against? All these sort of political definitions fall by the wayside when you have people like this.
Ambassador, if we look at Brexit, that's the British withdrawal from the European Union, would you define that as populism? And how does it differ, say, from Marine Le Pen's National Front in France?
Well, I think that in Brexit, what was experienced was a feeling by a majority of the British population that somehow the benefits of being part of the European Union, the benefits of globalization, were not being equally shared across the population. And people wanted to send a message that the system was not working as it was, and they wanted to send a strong message of something different needed to happen. In a referendum, you don't get an opportunity to write a long essay. You get a chance to vote one way or the other. And so the message that indicated that economically people did not think they had opportunity, that they felt somehow that they were challenged, that British national identity was challenged, could be best manifested with a vote to leave.
So, Ambassador, at its essence, are we talking here about something called inequality?
Well, I think we're talking about people responding to the rapid pace of change in the world, to the movement of peoples, to greater diversities in societies, to immigration, and also to technological change and the impact it has on societies. And it creates understandable anxieties for people. There are winners and losers. The issue here is leaders offering simplistic solutions to complex problems and using genuine anxieties to advance their own political purposes.
Daniel, let's look at Latin America. Where do you see populism rising in that part of the world? And is it different in any way from the kind of populism that we've seen here in the United States?
Well, that's a great question. I think that there's to a certain extent, there are some similarities. Some of the, for example, messianic sort of presences that we see among some of the right-wing populist leaders in Europe, or at least in Northern Europe, or in the United States, does bear certain, at least superficial similarities with a figure like Hugo Chavez, for example, in Venezuela. Where I think it differs is that, if I might add to the first comment that was made about populism being a push against elites, I think that that is true for the most part. But an important part of that is that it's also a push against institutions. These are movements that place the leader the beloved leader of a movement in contrast to the existing institutions, and that uses the popularity of that leader to either co-opt or sideline those institutions. And I think that that's sort of the story of Latin America. The French Revolution with Danton was mentioned previously, where you had populism on the left and the right. During that period, France had, I believe, 10 constitutions in a period of a dozen years. That's been Latin America's experience. In Venezuela, a constitution, on average, has lasted about as long as a laptop. It's had 26 constitutions in 200 years. Bolivia's had 18. Ecuador has had 19. So there are, there's a wave of overcorrections between populist left and usually more of a status quo right that tends to rise and fall with commodity cycles. Populists get elected during low points in the cycle, usually, as we saw during the so-called pink tide wave 10 years ago. And then they often get overthrown or elected out of office, depending on how long they have left in their terms when commodities collapse and the economy fails. So there's definitely an economic story to be told here. But there are some fundamental differences as well.
Okay, let's bring in Tian Wei from Beijing. And Tian Wei, Asia has its own brand of populism. Its flag bearer right now, of course, is the Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte. He was once described as an outsider. He didn't have much of a foothold in mainstream politics in the Philippines, but he's there now. He's the leader. He's seen as a strongman populist. Is that a fair description?
Well, I think we have to be very careful, and if I could be frank here, by using the phrase, the rise of populism. Of course, at times when you see changes, there are certain phrases are always more popular than the others. At the time, it was globalization, and now it becomes the rise of populism. I think we have to be very careful with this. Also reflected with the U.S. presidential election. If you and I could go back a little bit, look at this election, because that's where this phrase has been used most of the time, and to look at whether it is a rise of populism that is really representing so-called democracy of the majority. By the way, you know this better than I do, that the turnout of this election is not necessarily high. Therefore, you can't say majority of Americans voted. Secondly, you also have the popular votes going to one candidate while the electoral vote going to the other. And meanwhile, you have seen the demographic changes going on in the United States society, that the so-called weaker party and also so-called the grassroots is not just the low-income white male anymore. It is actually a lot of different kinds of social groups and ethnic groups. So it's very hard to say that it's really a rise of populism in the United States. And so I can say about Asia, for example, in the countries of the Philippines, there are different kinds of social groups and also social movements going on over there. And certainly there is a politician who is very charismatic, using a lot of different kinds of words during his campaign. But we should give them the benefit of the doubt once they come into the office as to where the policy is going. And so do many media arguing about Mr. Donald Trump, the president-elect in the United States. So I guess it's your business back in the U.S. as to what the choice should be, but we have to be very careful with the use of the rise of populism and whose interest is it really represent.
All right, you make a great point. We shouldn't forget that more people in the United States voted against the populist. Hillary Clinton actually is winning the popular vote in the United States. Nathan, when we look at the rise of Duterte in the Philippines, Trump here in the United States, Narendra Modi in India, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Brexit phenomenon, do you see any parallels?
I do. I just want to pick up on something that Tian Wei saying, that most people didn't vote for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump was a complete outsider who basically came from nowhere, defeated 16 Republican candidates and Hillary Clinton, who was the presumptive choice of the establishment. So even though he may not have got the popular vote, his whole rise basically reflected populism. And this is where the comparison is that they've written off these people as they rose. I mean, Duterte was considered a joke by the Americans until he won. The same with the National Front in France. Marine Le Pen and, of course, her father were written off, except when they keep on actually putting dents in the political system. And they tend to have a couple of things in common. They tend to actually try and hark back to something rather than forward. Make America great again. Jean-Marie Le Pen, of course, World War II parachute hero. Duterte talking about a more comfortable time under the Marcoses, in the Philippines. But they also look to the future and say, we can't take this anymore. We're mad as hell and we can't take this anymore. And I think the point about challenging institutions is very important. And let's face it, to some extent in every political system, governing is based on consent.
Right.
And I think there's a feeling that by many people, it's not just economic dislocation, that they are not consulted about changes in their society anymore.
Ambassador, where do we see populist trends in Europe? I mean, to what extent is it driven by rich countries like Germany, perhaps bullying smaller, poorer countries like Greece? We saw that happen not so long ago. Does it undermine democracy? Because if we look at a party like Syriza in Greece, here was a party that had to basically roll back most of their election platform because it was not acceptable to a powerful country like Germany in the European Union.
Right. I mean, in the European Union, you have the issue of individual member states wanting to have greater control over their own economic destinies and as well as their own cultural futures. And they, in some cases, say that they oppose what they sometimes describe as diktats coming from Brussels. I think the unifying trend here is those who are favoring the idea of openness, diversity, open free economies, free expression as something that is good for their societies and their futures and their own economic opportunity, and those who believe that the solution to the problems and anxieties that they feel is closing borders, taking national solutions rather than trying to engage the rest of the world and address problems together. So in a way, I think the way populism is being manifested in Europe and elsewhere is really now a battle between those who favor openness and those who look to solutions in the direction of closing societies and building walls.
Well, let me get Daniel's view on that. Daniel, globalization, the removal of barriers, has to an extent been blamed for the rise of populism. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, that's a great question, and it has parallels to what we saw with the rise of right-wing populist movements in the 1920s and 1930s in Europe, which was also an age in which a prolonged recession led to a rise in trade barriers and a period of globalization with a lot of free movement of both capital and manpower was tampered down in response. So I think that is part of the story. And beyond that, the fall of borders and the rise of certain technologies, for example, Facebook, Twitter, which allow for a type of echo chamber ideologically, but which also tends to, barring linguistic differences, create more accessibility from one country to another. So you have more contagion in a sense. And that's something that we saw when Venezuela, for example, rewrote its constitution during the rising pink tide in 2000. You had 4 or 5 other Latin American countries rewrite their constitution within the next 8 years, completely. And that's something in which your frame of reference tends to both, as a reader, tends to both find ready ways to reinforce itself through media, but at the same time tends to cross borders. And I think that that's something that makes the contagion spread a little bit more. And it is worrying because there's very few examples in which you find a post-populist country, a country that's gone through a prolonged populist period and then returns to, let's call it institutional normalcy, and is better off than when it started.